There is a particular kind of quiet that only comes with age. Not the quiet of an empty room, or the quiet of a late night when the neighborhood has gone to sleep. This is something different. This is the quiet that settles into a man's bones after enough years have passed, after enough people have gone, after enough mornings have come and gone without anything in them worth remembering. It is not painful, exactly. It is just there, like the way an old coat fits familiar, a little heavy, and not something you think about putting on anymore because you stopped thinking about it a long time ago. I have lived in this house on Delaware Road for 39 years. I built the back porch myself in the summer of 1991. Replaced the kitchen floor twice. Repainted the shutters so many times, I stopped counting after the 5th coat. There is not a single board in this house I have not touched with my own hands. Not a single corner I do not know by heart. A man who spends 40 years working with wood learns to read a house the way other men read faces. He knows where it is tired. He knows where it is holding. This house has been holding for 3 years now. That is how long Dorothy has been gone. I do not say that to draw sympathy. I say it because it is the truth, and because it is the kind of truth that shapes everything else, the way you make your coffee in the morning, the side of the bed you still sleep on, the way you set one plate on the table and then stand there for just a second longer than necessary before you sit down. 3 years is long enough that the sharpest edges have worn down, but it is not so long that the shape of her absence has stopped being the shape of everything. I was 64 when she passed. We had been married 37 years. She used to say I was the quietest man she had ever known. And she meant it as a compliment. Most of the time. Dorothy was the kind of woman who filled a room without trying. Not loud, not performative, just present in a way that made the air feel different when she was in it. I was the kind of man who could go 3 days without saying more than a dozen words to anyone and feel no particular discomfort about it. We balanced each other. That is the only way I know how to describe it. She was the warm light in the window, and I was the steady old house around it. Now there is just the house. I wake up most mornings around 5:30, which is earlier than I need to, and earlier than most people would choose. But my body has not gotten the message that I am retired, and there is nowhere to be. 40 years of getting up before the sun does not disappear because you hang up your tool belt. I make coffee in the same blue percolator Dorothy bought at a yard sale in 2003. I take it out to the front porch if the weather allows, or to the kitchen table if it does not, and I sit with it for a while before the day asks anything of me. On a clear morning from the front porch, you can see most of Delaware Road stretching out in both directions. It is not much to look at by most standards, a 2-lane road with no sidewalks, maybe 14 or 15 houses spread out over a quarter mile. Big yards, old trees, the kind of neighborhood that has not changed much in 30 years and probably will not change much in the next 30 either. Clover Hill is that kind of town. Things move slowly here. People stay. The hardware store on Main Street has been run by the same family for 3 generations. The diner 2 blocks down still serves coffee for $1.25, and nobody has raised the price because the owner, Patty Greer, says if she raises it, she will have to hear about it from Earl Hutchins, and she is not in the mood. That was always how Earl came up in conversation around Clover Hill. As a footnote, as a character in someone else's story. The man at the diner who always ordered the same thing. The man who nodded at you in the hardware store but never stopped to talk. The man who kept his yard exactly the way he wanted it and had opinions about things but shared them quietly, if at all. I knew Earl Hutchins the way you know a piece of furniture in a room you pass through every day. He was simply there, present, constant, but not known. He moved in next door 20 years ago, in the fall of 2004. I remember because Dorothy and I had just finished adding the sunroom, and I was still cleaning up sawdust when the moving truck pulled into the driveway next door. Dorothy suggested I go introduce myself. I said I would give him time to settle in first. I never did go introduce myself. And somehow 20 years passed, and we never got further than a nod across the fence and the occasional remark about the weather. That is the kind of neighbor Earl was. And, if I am being honest, that is the kind of neighbor I was, too. The fence between our properties is a low thing, 4 feet of cedar post and rail that I built myself about 15 years ago, more to define the boundary than to block the view. From my front porch, I can see straight into Earl's yard, and he could see straight into mine. We were close enough that I knew his habits without meaning to. I knew he took his coffee on the porch every morning, same as me. I knew he drove into town on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I knew he kept a small vegetable garden along the south wall of his house and that he took it seriously. The way a man takes seriously the things that give him a reason to get up in the morning. What I did not know was anything that mattered. I did not know where he had come from before Clover Hill. I did not know if he had family somewhere. I did not know what had brought him to this particular street in this particular small town in Tennessee, or what had kept him here. I did not know what he thought about when he sat in those 2 chairs on his front porch, and there were always 2 chairs, which I had noticed over the years without ever asking about. 2 chairs. 1 man. I had filed it away as one of those small, unexplained things that accumulate in a life lived next to strangers. Maybe he had a friend who visited sometimes. Maybe he just liked the look of 2 chairs. Maybe it was none of my business. Which was the conclusion I always came back to. That Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of November started like any other. I was on my porch by 5:45 with my coffee, watching the sky go from dark gray to pale gray to the thin, cold blue of an early winter morning. The temperature had dropped overnight. My breath made small clouds in the air. The oak tree in the front yard had lost most of its leaves by then, and they were gathered in damp piles along the fence line, the way they always were this time of year, waiting for me to get around to them. I looked over toward Earl's house, the way I always did, without thinking much about it. His porch light was off. That was not unusual on its own. Earl did not always leave his porch light on overnight. But there was something else. A stillness on his side of the fence that felt different from the ordinary stillness of an early morning. I could not have explained it precisely. It was more of an absence than a presence. The way a room feels different when you walk in and realize, before you see anything, that no one is home. I drank my coffee and watched. By 6:30, there was still no light in any of Earl's windows. No movement behind the glass. His truck, a dark green Ford F-150 that had to be at least 15 years old, was parked exactly where it always was, in the same spot on the gravel drive, at the same angle. That was the thing that caught my attention more than anything else. Earl always moved his truck on Tuesday mornings. He drove it into town, parked it in front of the diner, had his breakfast, made his rounds. It was as reliable as the calendar. I had watched him do it so many times over the years that I had stopped registering it as anything more than background. Tuesday morning, green truck, gone by 7. It was now past 6:30 on a Tuesday, and the truck had not moved. I told myself there were a dozen reasonable explanations. He was sleeping in. He was not feeling well. He had changed his routine. People were allowed to change their routines. I had changed mine plenty of times since Dorothy passed, though mostly in the direction of doing less rather than more. I finished my coffee, went inside, washed the cup, and tried not to think about it. By 8 o'clock, I was thinking about it again. I went back out to the porch with a second cup, which I almost never do. The morning had brightened but not warmed. The sky was the color of old tin, and there was a wind coming through that meant business. I stood at the porch railing and looked across at Earl's house, and there was still nothing. No lights, no movement, no sound from his side of the fence at all. I am not a man who intrudes. I was raised to believe that a man's property is his own, and his business is his own, and you do not cross that line uninvited. My father held that view firmly, and I had absorbed it so thoroughly over the years that it had become less of a principle and more of a reflex. You stay on your side. You tend to your own. You do not go looking for other people's problems. But Dorothy would have been over there by 7. That thought arrived quietly and settled in without asking permission. She would not have deliberated about it the way I was deliberating. She would have made a plate of something warm, walked across the yard, knocked on the door, and that would have been the end of it. She had a kind of courage in ordinary moments that I had always admired and never quite managed to replicate. The courage to simply show up, to say, without words, I noticed you, and I am here. I set my coffee cup on the railing. I stood there another few minutes, watching, waiting for something to move on the other side of the fence. A curtain, a shadow, anything. The wind pushed through the oak tree above me, and a few last leaves came loose and drifted down into the yard. Somewhere down the road, a car started up and pulled out of a driveway, and the sound faded away, and the quiet came back and settled in again, heavier than before. I walked down the porch steps and across my yard to the fence. The latch on the gate between our properties had not been touched in years. I was not even sure it still worked, but it opened without too much complaint. Just a stiff pull and a groan of old metal, and then I was on Earl's side of the fence. For the first time in 2 decades of living next door to the man. The grass under my boots was heavy with frost. My breath came out in slow, white clouds. I walked up toward the house with my hands in my jacket pockets, moving carefully, like a man who is not entirely sure he has the right to be where he is. Earl's yard was neat and spare. He had always kept it that way. The vegetable garden along the south wall had been cleared out for the season, just bare, dark earth and a few wooden stakes still standing where the tomato plants had been. There was a stack of firewood against the side of the house, covered with a tarp, and a pair of work boots by the side door, and a wind chime hanging from the eave that had gone quiet in the still air. Everything in its place. Everything tended to. It was a yard that told you something about the man who kept it. Not much, but something. He was orderly. He was patient. He did not waste effort, but he did not neglect things either. He was the kind of man who covered his firewood before the weather turned and put his tools away before he came inside. I came around to the front of the house and stopped. The front porch was narrow, the way most old houses in Clover Hill were built, just wide enough for a man to sit and watch the road. And there on that porch, side by side, were the 2 chairs I had seen from my own yard for 20 years without ever getting close to. They were ladder-back chairs, handmade, the kind of work that takes time and care. The wood was old but well-maintained, oiled regularly, kept out of the worst of the weather when the seasons turned. One of them showed the particular worn smoothness of long use, the armrests darkened and polished by years of hands resting there. The other was different. It was the same age, the same craftsmanship, but it had a quality of preservation about it that stopped me. The surface of the seat was smooth but not worn. The armrests had not been darkened by use. It was a chair that had been cared for without being sat in. I stood there looking at them for a long moment. Then I stepped up onto the porch and looked more closely at the second chair, the one that had never been sat in. And I saw what was carved into the top rail of the backrest. Not deep, not decorative, just simple, Careful letters pressed into the wood with a steady hand. 2 words and a date. I read them once, and then I read them again, and the cold morning air seemed to go a little colder, and the quiet seemed to go a little quieter. And I stood there on Earl Hutchins' front porch with my hands at my sides and tried to understand what I was looking at. I had seen that handwriting before. Not recently. Not in years. But there are things a man does not forget, no matter how much time passes. No matter how many layers of ordinary life get laid down on top of them. A particular way of forming letters. A particular slant to the hand. You do not forget the handwriting of someone you once loved. You just stop expecting to see it. I did not touch the chair. I stepped back off the porch and stood in Earl's front yard in the cold November morning and looked up at his house. Dark windows, closed door, no sign of life. And I felt something shift inside me. Not panic, not quite. Something slower and deeper than panic. The feeling of a man who has just realized that the ground beneath his feet is not exactly what he thought it was. I went back to my own yard and sat down on my porch steps and did not go inside for a long time. I do not know how long I sat on those steps. Long enough for the frost to finish melting off the grass. Long enough for 2 cars to pass on Deller Road, and for the mail truck to come and go without stopping at my box. Long enough for the cold to work its way through my jacket and settle into my shoulders the way cold does when you get past 60 and your body stops pretending it does not notice. I kept seeing those 2 words and that date carved into the wood. I am not going to tell you what they said. Not yet. Some things need time to arrive at properly. The same way a long road needs to be walked before the destination means anything. What I will tell you is that they were not Earl's words. I knew that the moment I read them. The handwriting was not a man's handwriting. It was precise and deliberate in a way that I recognized from a long time ago, from letters passed across a truck seat on a summer evening. From notes left tucked under a wiper blade in a parking lot. From a time in my life when I was a different kind of man than I became. A younger kind. A more frightened kind. Though I would not have used that word then. I went inside eventually and stood at the kitchen window with a glass of water I did not drink, looking out at the backyard and the fence line and the corner of Earl's house visible over the top of the cedar rails. The oak tree in my front yard threw a long shadow across the frost-pale grass. A crow landed on the fence post nearest the gate, looked around with that flat, intelligent gaze crows have, and then lifted off again without ceremony. I thought about calling someone, though I was not sure who. I did not have children to call. My son lives up in Nashville, and we talk on the phone about once a month, in the careful, slightly formal way that 2 people talk when they love each other but have never quite learned how to say so. I have a brother in Knoxville, but we are not close in the way that distance alone does not explain. There are people in Clover Hill I have known for decades, men I worked alongside, neighbors I have waved to from driveways, but not the kind of people you call when something happens that you cannot explain and are not sure how to feel about. Dorothy had been that person. The only one, if I am honest about it. In the end, I did not call anyone. I put on my boots and my heavier coat, and I drove into town. Clover Hill sits in a shallow valley between 2 long ridges that the locals have always called the Brothers, though nobody seems to know anymore why they were given that name, or when. The town itself is not large, maybe 4,000 people if you count the outlying farms and the new subdivision they put in about 10 years ago off Route 9, which most of the older residents still refer to with a certain quiet disapproval, as though the subdivision had done something personally offensive to the landscape. Main Street is 4 blocks long. There is a hardware store, a diner, a pharmacy, a barber shop, a small grocery, a branch of the county library that is open 4 days a week, and a Baptist church at the far end whose white steeple is the tallest thing in town. I parked in front of the hardware store and walked down to the diner. Patty Greer's place has been called simply Patty's for as long as I can remember. It is the kind of diner that has not changed its menu or its decor in 30 years and sees no reason to. The booths are red vinyl, the counter stools are chrome and cracked leather, and the coffee comes in white ceramic mugs that have been washed so many times the printing has faded to near nothing. It smells like bacon grease and dish soap, and something underneath both of those things that I have never been able to identify, but that means, to me, Tuesday morning in Clover Hill as reliably as anything else. I took a stool at the counter, and Patty filled my mug without being asked. She is a small woman. Patty. Somewhere in her mid-60s. With gray hair she keeps short, and a manner that is efficient without being unfriendly. She has run this place since her husband passed in 2008, and she has never once given any indication that running it is anything other than exactly what she intends to keep doing. I asked her, as casually as I could manage, whether she had seen Earl Hutchins that morning. She set the coffee pot down and looked at me with the particular attention of a woman who has spent 40 years reading people across a counter. She told me Earl had not come in, said it was the first Tuesday she could remember him missing in a good long while. Then she said that Bobby Pruitt, who drives for the county ambulance service and comes in for coffee before his shift, had mentioned something that morning about a call-out on Route 12 the previous evening. An older man, found at home. She had not paid it much mind at the time. I asked her what hospital. She told me. I drank half my coffee and left the rest. On the drive back, I took the long way without planning to, which meant I came down Deller Road from the north end and passed by the old Faber house at the corner of Deller and Millbrook before I reached my own place. The Faber house had been empty for years, since old Gerald Faber went into the care facility over in Harlan County. It was a 2-story white clapboard house with a deep front porch and a magnolia tree in the yard that was older than the house itself. The paint was peeling in long strips along the window frames, and the porch boards were beginning to go soft, and the yard had that particular tired look of a place that has been left too long without anyone to tend it. I almost did not look at it as I drove past, but something made me slow down, some instinct I could not name. The same instinct that had made me look twice at Earl's yard that morning. And I turned my head as I rolled by. There was a woman standing in front of the Faber house. She was standing at the edge of the yard. Not on the porch, just standing near the old magnolia tree with her hands in the pockets of a dark wool coat. Looking up at the house, the way a person looks at something they are trying to decide about. She was not young. I could see that even from the car, but she was not bent or slow either. She stood with a stillness that was not the stillness of uncertainty. It was the stillness of someone who has traveled a long way to stand in a particular place and is taking a moment to let that mean something. I drove past. I got about 50 yards down the road, and then I stopped the truck and sat there with the engine running and my hands on the wheel. I do not know how to explain what happened in the next few seconds, except to say that recognition is a strange thing. It does not always arrive as a thought. Sometimes it arrives as something physical, a tightening in the chest, a shift in the quality of the air, a sudden stillness that spreads outward from your center before your mind has caught up with what your body already knows. I had not seen that woman in 42 years. She had gray in her hair now, and she carried herself with the particular uprightness of a woman who had learned over a long life to take up exactly as much space as she needed and no more. But the way she stood, the angle of her shoulders, the way she held her head when she was looking at something she was thinking hard about, I knew her. I put the truck in reverse and sat there another moment with my foot on the brake, and the cold November morning held itself very still around me. And somewhere behind my ribs, something that had been quiet for a very long time shifted and made itself known. Then I put the truck back in drive and went home. I did not stop. I am not proud of that, but it is what happened. And this is that kind of story. The kind where the truth matters more than how it reflects on the man telling it. I sat in my kitchen for the rest of that morning and did not do much of anything useful. I had a list on the counter, the way I always do small chores, things that need attending to, the kind of low-level maintenance that fills a retired man's days and gives them a shape that might otherwise be hard to find. There was a section of gutter on the north side of the house that needed clearing. There was a hinge on the back door that had been loose for 2 weeks. There was a bag of grass seed I had been meaning to put down before the ground froze solid, though I had probably already missed the window on that one. I looked at the list and did not move from my chair. The coffee in my mug went cold. I let it. Outside the kitchen window, the sky had settled into that flat gray that means the day has decided not to offer anything more than what it has already given. A few sparrows worked their way along the fence line, pecking at whatever they found in the dead grass, and then they were gone. The wind had died down. Everything was very still. I kept thinking about the handwriting on that chair, and I kept thinking about the woman standing under the magnolia tree, and I kept thinking about the fact that Earl Hutchins, a man I had lived next to for 20 years without ever really knowing, was lying in a hospital bed in the county medical center. And that somehow these 3 things were connected in a way I could not yet see clearly, but could feel the shape of. The way you can feel the shape of something large in dark water without being able to make out what it is. Let me tell you something about the summer of 1982. I was 25 years old that summer, which feels like a different lifetime from where I am sitting now. And in some ways, it was. I was working for a framing crew out of Harlan County, driving 40 minutes each way 5 days a week, making decent money for a young man with no particular plans beyond working hard and saving what he could. I was renting a room from a widow named Mrs. Alcott on the east side of Clover Hill, paying $60 a month, which was reasonable even then. I had a truck that was already old when I bought it, and a set of tools I was slowly upgrading one piece at a time as the budget allowed. I was not looking for anything that summer, which is usually, I have found, exactly when something finds you. I met Maggie Foster at a church picnic in July. Not because either of us was particularly devoted. I went because my landlady asked me to carry some folding tables, and Maggie went because her mother expected it. We ended up at the same end of a long table under a stand of elm trees, eating potato salad and listening to a man with a guitar play hymns badly. And at some point we started talking, and did not stop until the mosquitoes came out and drove everyone inside. She was 23 years old. She had dark hair that she wore pulled back, and a way of listening to a person that made you feel like what you were saying was the most interesting thing she had heard all day, even when you knew it probably was not. She worked at the county library. She had grown up in Clover Hill, but spent 2 years at a college over in Virginia before coming back. And she carried those 2 years lightly, not as a credential, not as something that set her apart, just as part of the particular shape of who she was. We spent the rest of that summer together. I will not dress it up, or make it more than it was, or less than it was. We were young, and we were in love, in the way that young people are in love, completely and somewhat carelessly, with the unexamined confidence that the future is something that can be worked out later. We drove out to the reservoir on warm evenings and sat on the tailgate and talked about everything and nothing. We went to the movies in Harlan on Friday nights. We took a long drive one Sunday up through the mountains with no particular destination, and did not get back until well after dark. And it was one of those days that you know, even while it is happening, that you will carry it with you. I knew by September that I loved her. I knew by October that she loved me. And I knew by November, though I would not let myself think it through completely, that I was frightened. Not of her. Never of her. I was frightened of the size of it. I had not grown up in a house where love was handled well. My father was a hard man, in the way that men of his generation were often hard. Not cruel, but sealed up tight, with whatever warmth he had kept somewhere behind a door he rarely opened. My mother did her best and loved us in her way, but she had learned not to expect too much and had passed that lesson on without meaning to. I had grown up understanding, at some level that I never examined directly, that wanting something fully was a kind of risk, that you kept a part of yourself back, just in case, that the cost of being wrong about a person could be higher than you wanted to pay. Maggie was not a woman you could love halfway. She was not built for it, and she would not have accepted it, though she never said so, because she never had to. You simply knew, being near her, that she was the kind of person who brought everything she had to the things that mattered to her. And that terrified me, in a way I did not have the vocabulary for at 25, and only began to understand much later. In December of that year, I told her I thought we should slow things down. I said it carefully. I used the words that made it sound reasonable. I wanted to focus on my work. I was not sure I was ready. I cared about her too much to rush into something I was not certain of. She listened to all of it in that still, attentive way of hers. And when I was finished, she looked at me for a long moment and then nodded, once, and said she understood. She left Clover Hill the following spring. I heard she went back to Virginia, then later to somewhere else. Then later still, the trail went cold, the way trails do in a small town, when someone has made clear they do not intend to come back. I told myself it had been the right decision. I told myself she would be fine, that she would find someone better suited to what she needed, that I had done the honest thing by letting her go before things went further. I told myself those things for about 40 years, and most of the time, I mostly believed them. Dorothy came along 2 years later, and I loved her truly, in the steadier and more deliberate way I was capable of by then. We built a good life. I do not want to diminish that or make it sound like a consolation, because it was not. Dorothy was a remarkable woman, and our life together was real and full, and I was grateful for every year of it. But there is a particular kind of reckoning that comes to a man in the quiet years after the people who gave his life its shape have gone. Not regret, exactly. Regret is too active a word. More like a slow, steady accounting. The kind that does not accuse, but simply shows you the ledger and asks you to look at it honestly. I had looked at that ledger many times in the 3 years since Dorothy passed. I had never expected the ledger to show up in person and stand under a magnolia tree on Delaware Road. I got up from my kitchen chair and rinsed out my cold coffee and stood at the window for a long moment. Then I went and got my coat and my keys. I drove back down Delaware Road toward the Faber house. She was gone. The yard was empty. The magnolia tree stood alone in the gray afternoon light. There was no car parked at the curb, no sign that anyone had been there at all. And I sat in my truck in front of that empty yard for a minute, and then drove back home and went inside, and did not go out again for the rest of the day. That night I sat in the armchair by the front window, Dorothy's chair, which I had moved to that spot after she passed, because it was where she always sat in the evenings, and I had not been able to bring myself to move it back. And I looked out at the dark road and listened to the house settle around me in the cold. I thought about Earl Hutchins and a hospital bed. I thought about 2 chairs on a front porch, one worn and one waiting. I thought about handwriting I had not seen in 42 years, carved carefully into old wood. And I thought about a woman standing under a magnolia tree with her hands in her pockets, looking up at a house she used to know in a town she had left behind a long time ago. I did not sleep well that night. But somewhere close to morning, in that thin gray space between waking and sleep, a thought came to me with the quiet certainty of something that has been waiting a long time to be thought. Nothing about this was an accident. I woke up Wednesday morning with that thought still sitting in my chest where I had left it. Nothing about this was an accident. I made my coffee and took it to the porch the way I always do. But I did not stay long. The cold had deepened overnight, and there was a low mist sitting in the yard that had not lifted yet. The kind that turns the fence posts and the bare tree branches into gray shapes without edges. Earl's house was quiet on the other side of the fence, the way it had been quiet all day yesterday. But it was a different kind of quiet, now that I knew where Earl was. Not ominous, just empty. The way a house goes when its person is somewhere else. I went back inside and stood at the kitchen counter and thought about what I was going to do. The practical matter was straightforward enough. Earl was at the county medical center over in Harlan, about 18 miles east of Clover Hill. He had suffered a mild stroke, according to what Bobby Pruitt had told Patty, and he was stable and recovering. There was no emergency. There was no immediate reason for me to do anything at all, strictly speaking. Earl Hutchins and I were neighbors who had never been more than neighbors. And a man going to the hospital did not automatically become my concern. But the two chairs were my concern, and the handwriting was my concern, and the woman I had seen standing under the magnolia tree and then not stopped for, which I was still not entirely at peace with, was my concern in a way that went considerably deeper than the other two things. I decided I would go to the hospital. Not that day. I was not ready for that yet, and I was not sure what I would say when I got there. But I would go. In the meantime, there was something else I needed to do first. I needed to think clearly about what I actually knew, and what I was only guessing at. What I knew was this. Earl Hutchins had two chairs on his front porch. One was his. One had been made with care and kept unused for as long as I had been able to see his porch from my own yard, which was 20 years. The second chair had words carved into the backrest, in a handwriting I recognized as Maggie Foster's. I had not read those words carefully enough to be certain of every detail. I had been too startled to do much more than register the shape of them. But I had seen enough to know that the carving was deliberate and personal. Not decorative, not random. Someone had put those words there on purpose. And Maggie Foster had come back to Clover Hill on the same day Earl collapsed. Those two facts together were not a coincidence. I had lived long enough to know the difference between coincidence and convergence. And this was convergence. Things that had been moving toward each other for a long time, finally arriving at the same point. What I did not know was the nature of the connection between Maggie and Earl. I had known Maggie for the better part of a year, 42 years ago, and in all that time she had never mentioned a brother. She had talked about her parents. Her father worked at the mill over in Harlan. Her mother kept a large garden and made preserves every fall. But she had spoken of herself as though she were an only child, or close enough to it. I had never pressed her on the subject. It was not the kind of thing you pressed a person on when you were 25 and in love, and the whole world felt like it was made of summer evenings and long drives, and the particular quality of light at the reservoir just before dark. I had not known her as well as I thought I had. That was a humbling thing to sit with. And I sat with it for a while at the kitchen table, with my second cup of coffee going cold beside me. You can love a person and still not know them fully. You can spend months with someone, learn the sound of their laugh and the way they take their coffee and the particular subjects that make their eyes go bright, and still be ignorant of the things that shape them deepest. We were young. We gave each other the parts we knew how to give. The rest stayed behind the door, the way things do when you have not yet learned that the door should be opened. I thought about calling the hospital to ask about Earl's condition. But something stopped me. I was not family. I was barely an acquaintance. Whatever I said to explain my interest would sound strange. And strange was not what I wanted to be right now. I wanted to be quiet and careful, and to understand what was happening before I put myself in the middle of it. So I did the only other thing I could think of. I went back next door. The gate opened the same way it had the morning before. Stiff, a little reluctant, but willing enough. The frost was heavier this morning, and the grass crunched softly under my boots as I walked across Earl's yard. The mist had thinned a little, but not enough to make the morning feel open. Everything had that close, gray quality that November mornings get in this part of Tennessee, when winter is not quite here, but has already sent its intentions ahead. I went around to the front of the house and stood before the porch again. The two chairs were exactly as I had left them. Of course they were. Nothing had changed. Earl was in a hospital bed, and his house was locked, and his yard was empty, and the chairs sat side by side on the narrow porch the same way they had sat for 20 years. Patient and still. I stepped up onto the porch and crouched down in front of the second chair. In the daylight, with time to look properly, the carving was clearer than it had been yesterday morning, when the shock of recognition had made everything blurry at the edges. It was done with a small blade. Carefully, the letters were clean and even, pressed into the wood at the top rail of the backrest, where your hands would naturally rest if you were sitting back and looking out at the road. Whoever had carved them had taken their time. This was not something scratched in haste or impulse. This was something decided upon and then done with patience. 4 words. Not 2 words and a date, as I had first thought in the gray shock of yesterday morning. 4 words. I read them slowly. Still here. Still yours. I stayed crouched in front of that chair for a long time, without moving. The mist moved slowly across Earl's front yard. A cardinal landed on the porch railing a few feet from me, regarded me with the bright indifference of a bird that has no particular concern for human affairs, and then flew off again into the gray morning. Somewhere down Deller Road, a screen door banged shut, and a dog started barking and then stopped. Still here. Still yours. 4 words. And they had been sitting on that porch, carved into that wood, for God only knew how long. 20 years, possibly. The same 20 years I had spent 40 feet away on the other side of a cedar fence, living my life, drinking my coffee, tending my house, missing Dorothy, getting older, letting the days go by with the quiet acceptance of a man who has made his peace with the way things turned out. 40 feet. I stood up slowly, the way a man my age stands up from a crouch, carefully, with a hand on the armrest for support. And I stepped back off the porch and walked back across the yard and through the gate and back to my own side of the fence. I sat down on my porch steps and did not go inside for a long time. There are moments in a man's life when the past stops being the past, not a memory, not a reflection, not the kind of thing you turn over in your mind on a quiet evening and feel something mild and distant about. I mean the past becoming present tense, arriving without warning, sitting down across from you at the kitchen table, and refusing to be anything other than exactly what it is. I had spent 42 years thinking of Maggie Foster in the past tense, not constantly, not with the kind of obsession that makes a man useless to the life in front of him. Dorothy would not have married a man like that, and I would not have been a good husband to her if I had been. But Maggie was there the way certain things are always there, the way you know a particular road without having to think about it, the way a piece of music can take you somewhere specific the moment the first note sounds. She was a part of the geography of who I was, present underneath everything else, not demanding attention, but there. And now she was here, in Clover Hill, on Delaware Road. I spent most of Wednesday doing the chores I had ignored the day before. I cleared the gutter on the north side. I fixed the hinge on the back door. I raked the leaves along the fence line into a pile and stood looking at it for a while, without burning it, because I did not have the energy for fire. Small tasks, the kind that keep your hands busy and leave your mind exactly where it was when you started. By afternoon, I had made a decision. I was going to the Faber house, not to confront anyone, not with any clear plan of what I would say. But if Maggie was in Clover Hill, and she had come back because of Earl, then she was likely staying somewhere nearby. And the Faber house was the most logical place. Gerald Faber's daughter, Louise, managed the property from somewhere up in Ohio and had been renting it out occasionally to cover the taxes. It was not much to look at, but it was furnished and available, and it was on Delaware Road, which meant it was close to Earl, which meant it was close to me. I drove down to the corner of Delaware and Millbrook at around 3 in the afternoon. The Faber house looked the same as it always did, tired and a little defeated. The way vacant houses get when they have been cared for by obligation rather than affection. But there was a car in the driveway now, a silver sedan with Virginia plates, which told me something I had already half known. I sat in my truck at the curb for about 2 minutes. Then I got out. The front walk was cracked and uneven, heaved up by the roots of the old magnolia, and I picked my way along it carefully to the porch steps. The boards were soft underfoot, the way I had noticed from the road, but they held. I knocked on the front door and then stood back and put my hands in my jacket pockets and waited. It took long enough that I had time to consider leaving. I was actively considering it, running the calculation of whether it would be better to go back to my truck and come up with a more thoughtful approach, when I heard footsteps inside, and then the sound of the deadbolt turning. The door opened, and there she was, 65 years old, gray in her hair, which she still wore pulled back the way she always had, though looser now, less severe. A few more lines around her eyes and at the corners of her mouth than I remembered. But they were the kind of lines that come from living rather than from hardship. And her eyes themselves dark brown, steady, the kind of eyes that have always seen more than they let on, were exactly the same as I remembered them. She looked at me without surprise. That was the first thing I noticed. She was not startled to find me on her doorstep. She did not blink or pull back or put a hand to her chest the way people do when something catches them off guard. She simply looked at me with those steady eyes and was quiet for a moment. And then the corner of her mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. She said my name, just my name, Ray, the same way she had always said it. Not flat, not emphatic, just steady, like a fact she had always been at peace with. I said hello. We stood there looking at each other for a moment, across 42 years and a threshold. And then she stepped back and opened the door wider, and I went inside. The Faber house smelled of old wood and whatever cleaning product someone had used to make it habitable, with a faint trace underneath of something that might have been coffee. The front room was furnished with the spare, slightly mismatched furniture of a rental property. A couch, 2 armchairs, a lamp, a coffee table with a ring stain on it that predated the current occupant by years. There was a coat draped over one of the armchairs and a pair of reading glasses on the coffee table next to a paperback book, face down, spine carefully unbroken, the way people treat books they intend to finish. She had been here at least a day, maybe 2. She asked if I wanted coffee, and I said yes, because it gave us something to do with the first few minutes. I followed her into the kitchen and stood near the doorway, while she worked the small drip machine on the counter. And we talked about nothing important: the drive from Virginia, the cold snap that had come through, the state of the Faber house, which she said was better than she had expected and worse than it looked from the outside. We were both doing the thing that people do when they need to let a conversation find its own level before they can say what they actually came to say. She handed me a mug, and we went back to the front room and sat down, she in the armchair with her coat on it, moving the coat to the other chair, and me on the couch with my coffee held in both hands, because the house had the particular cold of a place that had not been properly heated in a while. She looked at me with those steady eyes and waited. I told her I had been to Earl's porch. Something shifted in her face when I said that. Not alarm exactly, but a careful attention. The kind that means a person is deciding how much to say and in what order to say it. I told her I had seen the chairs. I told her I had read what was carved on the second one. She was quiet for a moment. She looked down at her coffee mug and then back up at me. She asked me how long I had known Earl was my neighbor. I told her the truth. 20 years, since the fall of 2004. I told her we had never been more than nodding acquaintances. I told her I was not sure I had ever heard the sound of his voice. She closed her eyes briefly, and then opened them again, and I could see something in them that looked like the particular exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a complicated thing for a very long time. She said his name quietly. Earl. The way you say a name when the person it belongs to is somewhere uncertain, and you are not yet sure what condition he is in. Then she told me she had spoken to the hospital that morning. He was stable. The stroke had been mild. They expected a full recovery, or close enough to it. He would likely be moved from the ICU to a regular room by the end of the week. I said I was glad to hear it. She nodded. Then she said something that I had not expected, though perhaps I should have. She said she owed me an explanation. I told her she did not owe me anything. She said she owed it to herself, then, which was a different thing entirely. And the particular quiet certainty with which she said it reminded me so sharply of the woman I had known at 23 that I had to look away for a moment at the ring stain on the coffee table and collect myself. She set her mug down on the table and folded her hands in her lap and looked at me steadily. And she began to talk. She did not begin at the beginning. That is not how people tell the truth about things that have been held a long time. They begin somewhere in the middle, where the weight is heaviest, and work their way outward from there. Maggie began with Earl. She told me that Earl was her brother, older by 6 years, which would have made him 31 that summer we were together, though he had not been living in Clover Hill then. He had been in the Army, stationed overseas, and had come home to Tennessee only after his discharge in the mid-'80s. By then, Maggie had already left Clover Hill and was building a life elsewhere, and the two of them had stayed close in the way that siblings sometimes manage across distance phone calls, occasional visits, a loyalty that did not require proximity to stay intact. I asked her why she had never mentioned him. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she and Earl had a complicated history with their family, and that during the time we were together, she had been in the middle of sorting out what parts of that history she wanted to carry forward and what parts she needed to set down. Earl had been one of the parts she was still sorting. She had not been ready to talk about him yet. And then, before she got to the point of being ready, everything between us had ended, and there was no longer anyone to tell. I sat with that for a moment. It was not an accusation. She did not say it like one. But it landed with the particular weight of a truth that is accurate without being unkind. And that is sometimes the heaviest kind. She went on. After she left Clover Hill in the spring of 1983, she went back to Virginia. She finished the degree she had started before coming home. She built a career. She had worked in library sciences for most of her adult life, which did not surprise me at all. She had been married once, for 11 years, to a man she described simply as a decent person, with whom she had not been unhappy, which told me something about the marriage without telling me everything. No children. The marriage had ended quietly in the late 90s, the way some marriages do, not with drama or betrayal, just with the gradual acknowledgement that two people have grown into shapes that no longer fit together. She had lived alone since then. She had a house in a small city in the Shenandoah Valley. She had friends, a garden, work she still did part-time for a regional library consortium. A life that was full in the ways that matter and that she had built carefully and on her own terms. I listened to all of this the way you listen when you are aware that you are being given something significant and you do not want to interrupt it or hurry it along. I drank my coffee slowly, and I looked at her, and I let her talk. Then she came to the part about Earl moving to Clover Hill. In 2004, she said, Earl had decided he wanted to settle somewhere permanent. He had been moving around for years, a trait she attributed to the Army and to a restlessness that had been in him since childhood. And he was in his mid-50s by then and ready to stop. He had looked at several places and had eventually come back to Tennessee, to the county where they had grown up. Because there is something in a person that pulls them back to the land they started on, no matter how far they have traveled from it. He had found the house on Delaware Road through a real estate listing. She paused here. She looked at me with those careful eyes, and she said that the address had not been a coincidence. I set my coffee mug down. She said that Earl had known I lived on Delaware Road because she had told him. Not as an instruction, not as a plan of any kind. They had been talking on the phone one evening. This was sometime in the spring of 2004, and she had mentioned, in the way that you sometimes mention things that have been sitting quietly in your mind for a long time, that she had heard through an old acquaintance that Ray Caldwell was still in Clover Hill, still in the same house on Delaware Road, that he had married and seemed to be doing well. She had said it the way you say things you tell yourself you are simply reporting, when in fact you are testing how they feel when spoken aloud. Earl had listened, and a few months later, he had called her to say he had found a house. He had given her the address. She had recognized it immediately. I asked her if she had told him not to take it. She looked at me steadily for a moment before she answered. She said no. She had not told him not to take it. She had asked him why, and he had said that he had his reasons. And that was the end of the conversation on that particular subject. Earl was a man who did not elaborate when he felt he had said enough. It was a family trait, she added, with something that was almost a smile. I thought about that for a moment. A man I had never spoken to, moving in next door, knowing whose house he was moving next to, tending his yard, taking his coffee on the porch, driving into town on Tuesdays and Thursdays, living his quiet, orderly life 40 feet from mine for 20 years, watching out for me, in his way, without my knowledge or consent. I did not know how to feel about that. I still do not know, entirely. There is something in it that is strange, and something in it that is, if I am honest, quietly moving the idea that someone cared enough about another person to arrange their life in proximity to that person's life, simply to be near in case they were ever needed. Not intrusively, not obviously, just near. I asked her about the chairs. She was quiet for a little longer this time. She told me that 2 years after Earl moved to Clover Hill, in 2006, she had come to visit him for a week in late October. It was the first time she had been back to Tennessee in many years. She had not intended to come anywhere near Delaware Road. She had planned to stay in Earl's guest room, visit with him, drive through the countryside they had grown up in, and leave without stirring anything up. On her third day there, She had walked out onto Earl's front porch in the early morning and seen your house. She said it simply. Your house. As though it were a place she had always known the location of, even when she was not looking at it. She had stood on that porch and looked across the low fence at my house for a long time. She did not know if I was home. She did not know if I would have recognized her after 23 years if she had walked up to the door. She stood there in the October morning and looked at the place where I lived and felt something that she said she was not going to try to put a name to, because she had learned over the years that some feelings resist naming, and it is better not to force them into words that do not fit. She had gone back inside. That evening, she had asked Earl if he had any woodworking tools. He did. He always had. It was one of the things they had in common, a feeling for wood, for the patience that working with it required. He had a small shop in the back of his garage. Nothing elaborate, but enough. She had gone out to the shop after dinner, and she had worked for several hours. Earl had asked her once what she was making, and she had said, a chair, and he had nodded and left her to it. When she was finished, she had brought it out to the porch and set it beside Earl's chair and told him to keep it there. He had asked her why. She had said she was not entirely sure, but that it felt right. That it was a way of being present in a place without the complications of actually being present. That it was something she needed to leave here, even if she could not explain it fully. Even if no one ever understood it but her. Earl had kept the chair. He had oiled it every season and brought it inside when the weather turned severe and set it back out when spring came. For 18 years he had kept it exactly as she had left it, unused and cared for. Because his sister had asked him to, and because he was the kind of man who honored the things that mattered to the people he loved, even when those things were not entirely explicable. The carving, she said, she had done the last night before she left, after Earl had gone to bed. Alone on the porch in the October dark with a small blade and enough moonlight to see by. Still here, still yours. She said it quietly, looking at her hands in her lap, and the room was very still around us. I did not say anything for a long moment. Outside, the afternoon light was fading toward the early dark of November, and the cold in the house had deepened, and somewhere outside a wind had picked up and was moving through the bare trees along Deller Road with a sound like something being slowly let go. I sat with those words for a long time after she said them. Still here. Still yours. Not as an accusation. Not as a claim. Just as a truth she had carved into wood 18 years ago on a dark October porch because she needed somewhere to put it that was not inside her anymore. The way people put things into the ground sometimes, not to bury them and be done with them, but to give them a place to exist outside of the body, where they take up less room. I understood that more than I would have expected to. Sitting across from her in that cold, rented room, I said the only thing I could think to say, which was that I did not know what to do with what she had just told me. She said that was all right. She had not told me because she expected me to do anything with it. She had told me because Earl was in a hospital bed, and she was sitting in a rented house on the same road where I had lived for 39 years, and it seemed like the time for truth had finally arrived, whether either of us had planned for it or not. I asked her how long she was staying. She said she did not know yet. Until Earl was well enough to come home, at least. After that, she would see. I nodded. I finished my coffee, which had gone cold 20 minutes earlier, and I set the mug on the table next to her reading glasses and her unfinished book. I looked at the cover of the book without really seeing it. Then I stood up and put on my jacket and told her I was glad she had come back. I said it carefully, meaning it exactly as much as it sounded, and not a fraction more or less. She looked up at me from the armchair with those steady brown eyes and said she was glad too. I drove home in the early dark. The temperature had dropped again while I was inside, and the road had that hard, dry look it gets when a cold night is settling in for serious business. My headlights picked out the bare branches of the trees along the roadside and threw long shadows across the asphalt, and then swept them away again as I turned into my driveway. I sat in the truck for a moment after I cut the engine, not ready to go inside yet. Just sitting in the cold dark with my hands in my lap and the engine ticking as it cooled. The house looked the way it always looked, the porch light on, the front windows dark, the oak tree standing against the sky with its last few leaves still holding on against the wind. A house that had been lived in a long time and showed it. A house that knew me better than most people did, in the way that houses do when a man has given them enough years. I went inside and turned on the kitchen light and stood at the counter and looked at my reflection in the dark window over the sink. 67 years old, gray going to white, hands that showed the work they had done. The face of a man who had lived quietly and carefully, and, in at least one significant instance, out of fear rather than wisdom. I filled a glass of water and drank half of it and set it down. I thought about what she had said about the chair, about standing on Earl's porch and looking across at my house, about going into a shop after dinner and spending several hours making something with her hands, because she needed somewhere to put what she was feeling. I knew that impulse exactly. I had spent 40 years making things with my hands for the same reason. Because wood is honest. Because the work of shaping something requires your full attention and leaves no room for the things you are trying not to think about. And because when you are finished, you have something solid and real to show for the effort, which is more than you can say for most of what goes on inside a man's head. She had made a chair, and I had spent 20 years looking at it from 40 feet away, without knowing what it was. That thought had a particular quality to it that I did not rush past. I let it sit there and be what it was. Not self-pity, not recrimination, just the plain fact of it, held up in the light long enough to see clearly. I slept better that night than I had the night before, which surprised me. I had expected the conversation to leave me more unsettled, not less. But there is something in truth, even hard truth, even truth that costs you something to hear, that is easier to sleep next to than uncertainty. Uncertainty keeps a man up. Truth, at least, is something he can lie down with and know what he is dealing with. Thursday morning, I drove to the county medical center. The drive took about 25 minutes on the state road east of town, through country that was bare and brown with the season-harvested fields, tree lines stripped down to their essential shapes, the occasional farmhouse set back from the road with smoke coming from a chimney. I had made this drive plenty of times over the years for one reason or another, but I had never made it to visit Earl Hutchins. And I spent part of the drive trying to figure out what I was going to say when I got there. I did not come up with much. The medical center was a mid-sized regional hospital. Not large by city standards, but well equipped for the county, with a new wing added about 5 years back that still looked newer than the rest of the building. I parked and went in through the main entrance and spoke to the woman at the information desk, who looked up Earl's room number and told me he had been moved out of the ICU that morning and was on the 3rd floor. That was good news. I rode the elevator up and found the room at the end of a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax and the particular institutional warmth of a building that is kept at a temperature designed for patients rather than visitors. I stopped outside the door, which was open a few inches, and knocked on the frame. A voice told me to come in. It was a low voice, unhurried, with the particular flatness of a man who does not spend his words carelessly. I pushed the door open and went in. Earl Hutchins was propped up in the hospital bed at a slight angle, his hands resting on top of the blanket, looking at me with an expression that I could not immediately read. He was a big man. I had known that from a distance, but it was more apparent up close, broad through the shoulders, with a square, weathered face and gray hair cut short and practical. He had an IV line in his left arm and a monitor clipped to his finger, and there was a slight asymmetry in his expression that I recognized as the residual effect of the stroke. A mild heaviness on one side that the doctors would probably tell him would resolve with time and therapy. He did not look surprised to see me, which meant that either Maggie had called him, or he had simply lived long enough that nothing surprised him much anymore. With a man like Earl, I suspected it was probably both. I told him my name. I said I was his neighbor from Deller Road. He looked at me for a moment, and then he said, quietly and without particular inflection, that he knew who I was. Of course he did. I pulled the chair from beside the wall and sat down near the bed, and we looked at each other across the small space between us, two old men who had lived 40 feet apart for 20 years and were having their first real conversation in a hospital room in November. Which was not how either of us would have planned it, probably, but was where we had ended up. I asked him how he was feeling. He said he had felt better. He said it without complaint, just as a plain statement of fact, the way a man reports on a situation without editorializing about it. I said I was glad it had not been worse. He nodded once, slowly. Then we were both quiet for a moment. And in that quiet, I became aware of the particular quality of the silence between us. Not the silence of strangers who have nothing to say, but the silence of two people who have a great deal to say and are each waiting to see which direction the other one is going to come from. I decided to come from the honest direction. I told him I had been on his porch. I told him I had seen the chairs. I told him I had gone to see his sister. He watched me through all of this without changing expression. When I finished, he looked at the window for a moment. It had a view of the parking lot and a strip of gray November sky above the tree line. And then he looked back at me. He said that it had taken me long enough. I was not sure if he meant the visit to the porch, or the visit to Maggie, or something larger than both of those things. I suspected he meant the larger thing. I did not argue with him. I sat in that chair beside his bed, and the afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and lay across the floor in a pale stripe. And outside the room the hospital went about its business. And I thought about 20 years of Tuesday mornings and green trucks and two chairs on a porch. And I thought about all the ways that a man can live right next to the truth without ever quite walking up to it and reading what it says. It had taken me long enough. He was not wrong about that. I stayed at the hospital longer than I had planned. Earl was not a talkative man. That much was clear from the first 5 minutes. But he was a man who, once he had decided to say something, said it with a directness that I found I respected immediately and without reservation. There was no performance in him, no softening of edges to make things easier to receive. He simply said what was true and let you do what you wanted with it. We talked for about 2 hours that first afternoon. He told me things in the unhurried, methodical way of a man who has been waiting a long time to say them and has decided that waiting any longer serves no useful purpose. He began, not with Maggie and not with me, but with himself, with the particular shape of his life and how it had brought him to a hospital bed in Harlan County in November, with a neighbor he had never properly spoken to sitting in the chair beside him. He had grown up in this county, same as Maggie, same as me, though he was 6 years older and had run in different circles. He left at 19 to join the Army, which he said had been partly genuine vocation and partly the need to put distance between himself and a home situation he described only as difficult, and left it at that. I did not ask him to elaborate. Some things you recognize as closed doors and leave them that way. He served for 17 years. He had been in places he did not name and done things he did not describe. And what he brought back from all of it was a preference for quiet, an ability to observe without being observed, and a deeply settled sense of what mattered and what did not. He had come home to Tennessee in the mid-'80s and spent the following years moving construction work, mostly, which is how he had learned the woodworking that had eventually become the thing he did for its own sake rather than for income. He had been good with his hands his whole life. The army had given him discipline. The years after had given him time. He talked about Maggie with a plainness that told me everything about the nature of their bond. He said she was the only person in his family he had ever felt entirely easy with. Their father had been a hard man. He used almost the same words I had used about my own father, which gave me a small and uncomfortable start. And their mother had been a woman shaped by years of accommodation into someone who moved carefully through her own house. Maggie and Earl had found each other early, the way siblings sometimes do in difficult homes, and had held on. When she left Clover Hill in 1983, he said, she had called him from Virginia and told him about me. Not everything, not the details, just that she had loved someone and it had not worked out, and she was moving forward, and she was fine. He had believed the first 3 parts and reserved judgment on the last one. That was his way, he said. He believed what people told him about facts and waited to see about the rest. Over the years that followed, my name came up occasionally in their conversations. Not often, not with grief or bitterness, just as a reference point, the way you mention a place you once lived when it is relevant to something else you are saying. He had built up a picture of me over the years from those fragments, the way you build a picture of anyone you know only through someone else's account of them. He said it was an incomplete picture, obviously, and probably not entirely accurate, but it was what he had. Then in 2004, he had found the house on Deller Road. I asked him directly whether he had chosen it because of me. He looked at me for a moment with those level eyes and said, yes. He said it simply, without apology and without elaboration, the way he said most things. I asked him why. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window again, that parking lot, that strip of sky. And then he looked back at me and said that Maggie had spent 40 years being fine, and that he had spent 40 years watching her be fine, and that being fine and being whole were not always the same thing. He said he was not young anymore, and neither was she, and neither was I. And he had decided that proximity was better than distance when it came to things that had been left unfinished, even if proximity did not fix anything by itself. He said he had not had a plan exactly. He was clear about that. He had not moved in next door to engineer some kind of reunion or resolution. He had moved in next door because it seemed better than not moving in next door, and because he was tired of the distance. And because at 55 years old, a man starts to understand that the time for waiting to see how things turn out is not as unlimited as he once assumed. I sat with that for a while. Then I asked him about the chair. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, just a shift at the corner of his mouth, just a slight easing of the habitual stillness of his face. But it was there. He said that when Maggie had come to visit in 2006 and had spent an evening in his shop making something, he had known what she was making before she told him. He said he had known because he knew his sister, and because the only thing she would make in the middle of the night on a visit to a house 40 feet from the man she had once loved was something that let her be present without the risk of being present. He said he had kept the chair without question because she had asked him to, and because he understood, without needing it spelled out, that it mattered. I asked him if he had ever told anyone else about it. About any of it. He said no. I asked him if it had been hard to live next door to me for 20 years, knowing what he knew and never saying anything. He thought about that for a moment. Then he said that it had not been hard exactly. He said that keeping a thing was different from hiding a thing. Hiding implied deception. Keeping implied care. He had been keeping something for his sister because she had asked him to. And he had been keeping an eye on a neighbor because it was the right thing to do. And those two things had coexisted in his daily life for 20 years without particular difficulty. He paused, and then he said one more thing, quietly, as though it were simply an observation rather than the most significant thing he had said all afternoon. He said that in 20 years of watching me from across that fence, he had come to the conclusion that I was a good man who had made one significant error and had been paying for it quietly ever since, and that the paying had gone on long enough. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. I sat in that chair beside his bed until the light outside the window had gone completely, and the corridor outside the room had grown quieter, and a nurse came in to check his vitals and gave me the kind of look that suggested visiting hours were a thing that existed for a reason. I stood up and put on my jacket and told Earl I would come back. He nodded once, the way he did. I drove home through the dark with his words sitting in the truck with me, taking up space in the quiet the way important things do. A good man who had made one significant error and had been paying for it quietly ever since. The paying had gone on long enough. I turned onto Deller Road and passed the Faber house and saw the light on in the front window. The warm yellow light of a lamp in a room where someone was reading or thinking or simply sitting with the evening. And I drove on past and pulled into my own driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The paying had gone on long enough. I was beginning to think he might be right. Friday morning I woke up early, earlier than usual, and lay in the dark for a while before getting up. There was a particular quality to the darkness at 4 in the morning in November that I had always found both uncomfortable and clarifying. Uncomfortable because there is nothing to distract you at 4 in the morning. No light, no sound, no activity to pull your attention outward and away from whatever is sitting with you in the room. Clarifying for exactly the same reason. When there is nothing else to look at, you look at the thing you have been avoiding. And sometimes, in the honest dark, you can see it more clearly than you can in the busy light of an ordinary day. I lay there and I thought about what Earl had said. A good man who had made one significant error. I had been turning that phrase over since the drive home, examining it from different angles the way you examine a piece of wood before you decide how to work it. Looking for the grain, looking for the flaws. Trying to understand what it is actually made of before you put a tool to it. The error was not a mystery. I knew what it was. I had always known what it was. Even when I was dressing it up in more reasonable language, I was not ready. I was being honest. I was protecting her from something less than she deserved. Those things had all contained traces of truth, the way most rationalizations do. But the truth underneath them, the one I had never looked at directly, was simpler and less flattering. I had been afraid, not of Maggie, not of commitment in the abstract way that young men sometimes use as an excuse. I had been afraid of the specific, irreversible act of choosing, of saying here, this, fully, without the door left open behind me. I had grown up in a house where love was something that could be taken away, where warmth was rationed, where the ground beneath your feet was never entirely solid. And I had carried that into my adult life as a kind of permanent bracing against the possibility of collapse. Maggie had been the first person who made me want to stop bracing, and that had terrified me more than anything else. Because stopping meant trusting, And trusting meant exposure. And exposure meant that if it went wrong, the damage would be total rather than partial. So I had manufactured a reason to slow down. I had used language that sounded considered and mature. And I had stepped back from the edge. And I had told myself it was wisdom. It was not wisdom. It was the oldest kind of fear wearing wisdom's clothes. I got up at 5 and made my coffee and took it to the porch. But I did not sit down. I stood at the railing and looked out at the dark road and the dark shapes of the trees, and the faint light beginning to show itself in the east above the brothers. And I held my mug in both hands and let myself be clear about this. Not punishing, not theatrical, just clear. I had made a choice out of fear 42 years ago, and I had spent the years since constructing an account of it that allowed me to live with myself. And while I had lived with myself, the account had cost me something I had not fully acknowledged until now. The knowledge of what I might have been, of what we might have been, if I had been a different kind of man at 25. I could not change that. That was the most important part of the clarity, the part that comes after the accounting. You cannot change what you have done. You can only decide what to do with the truth of it, now that you are holding it plainly. I drank my coffee and watched the light come up over the brothers. That slow gray brightening that is November's version of dawn. Not dramatic, not golden, just a gradual lessening of dark. And by the time I went back inside, I had decided what I needed to do. I needed to talk to Maggie again, not because I had something to offer her. Not because I was laboring under any romantic notions about what was possible between two people in their 60s who had not seen each other in 4 decades. But because there were things I had never said, and she had said things to me through that chair. Through those 4 words. Through her presence in a cold, rented house on Deller Road that deserved an honest response. A real one. Not the careful, measured response of a man managing his exposure. The kind that costs something. I went inside and called the Faber house. She answered on the 3rd ring. I asked if I could come by that afternoon. I said I had some things I wanted to say. And I said it plainly so that she would know I meant it as something more than a social call. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said yes. I spent the morning doing nothing very useful, which was becoming a pattern. I made a half-hearted attempt at the grass seed and abandoned it. I sat at the kitchen table with a 2nd cup of coffee and looked at the crossword in the Tuesday paper, which I had not yet gotten to, and filled in about 4 answers before my mind went somewhere else and the pen went still. I thought about Dorothy. I thought about her often. Still, 3 years was not so long that the habit of thinking about her had broken. But I thought about her now in a particular way, with a particular question underneath the thought. Whether she had known. Not about Maggie. I had never told Dorothy about Maggie, which was something I was not proud of. Though I had told myself at the time that there was nothing to tell, that it was old business that had no bearing on what we had together. But whether she had known. The way that perceptive people sometimes know the shape of things without being told. That there was something in me that had been held back. That there was a room in me with the door not quite open. I thought she probably had. Dorothy was a perceptive woman. She would not have mentioned it, because it was not her way to press on things that were not offered. She loved me as I was, which was one of the great mercies of my life. And I had loved her back as fully as I knew how to. But fully as I knew how to was not the same as fully. And she would have understood that distinction without making it into a grievance. I hoped she had understood it. I hoped that whatever she had known about the held-back parts of me, she had been at peace with. And that the life we built together had been enough. I believed it had been. I had to believe it. And not just because believing it was easier, because it was also, I thought, true. We had been happy in the genuine and unspectacular way that long marriages are happy. And that was not nothing. That was, in fact, a great deal. But I was 67 years old, and I was still here. And she was not. And Maggie Foster was 3 houses down the road. And Earl Hutchins, from his hospital bed, had told me the paying had gone on long enough. I put on my good coat at 2 o'clock. Not the heavy work jacket I wore for chores, but the wool coat Dorothy had given me one Christmas that I wore maybe 3 times a year. To church and to funerals and to occasions that required something more than practical. I was not entirely sure why I chose it. Some instinct toward formality, maybe. Some sense that what I was about to go and do deserved to be dressed for properly. I walked down Della Road rather than drove. It was only 3 houses. The cold was steady but not bitter. The sky was the particular pale white of a November afternoon that has nothing more to offer and knows it. My boots made a quiet sound on the road, and the bare trees stood on either side without moving because there was no wind. And the whole of Clover Hill seemed to be holding itself very still, the way small towns do on winter afternoons when the business of the day has been transacted and nothing has yet come along to replace it. I turned up the Faber House walk and picked my way along the cracked concrete to the porch. The magnolia tree above me was entirely bare now, its branches making a complicated pattern against the white sky. I climbed the soft porch steps and knocked on the door. She opened it almost immediately, which told me she had been expecting me without having pretended otherwise. She was wearing a dark sweater and her hair was down. I had not seen it down before, not in the days since she had come back, and perhaps not in 42 years. And it was almost entirely gray now, long enough to touch her shoulders. And she wore it with the same unconcerned ease with which she wore everything about herself. She stepped back, and I went in. The house was warmer than it had been on Wednesday. She had figured out the heating. There was a smell of something cooking from the kitchen, something with onions and herbs. And the lamp in the front room was on, and her book was on the coffee table again. Further along than it had been 2 days ago. She had been here, living here, making it habitable. We sat down in the same places we had sat before, she in the armchair, me on the couch. And she looked at me with those patient, steady eyes and waited. I had thought about what I was going to say all morning and had not come up with anything that sounded right. So I did what I should have done more often in my life, which was to stop trying to find the right words and simply say the true ones. I told her that I owed her an apology. She did not say anything when I said that. She did not wave it off or tell me it was not necessary, or redirect the conversation towards something less uncomfortable. She simply sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at me and waited, which was the most honest thing she could have done, and also, in the moment, the most difficult thing for me to sit across from. I had not apologized to many people in my life. Not because I had not done things that warranted apology, but because I was a man who had always found it easier to carry things silently than to put them into words. That was the same instinct that had gotten me into this particular trouble in the first place, the belief that what you did not say could not hurt anyone, that silence was a kind of neutrality, that keeping things inside was the same as managing them carefully. I had learned, over 67 years, that this was not true. But knowing a thing and doing something about it are separated by a distance that varies from person to person. And for me, that distance had always been considerable. I told her that what I had done in December of 1982 had not been what I told her it was. I told her I had not needed more time, and I had not been protecting her from uncertainty, and I had not been doing the honest thing by stepping back. I told her I had been afraid of the size of what I felt for her, afraid of what it would mean to commit to it fully, afraid of the particular vulnerability that comes with loving someone completely, and knowing they could leave or be taken, or simply turn out to be something different from what you believed. I told her I had grown up in a house where love was not reliable, and that I had carried that into everything I did after, and that she had been the person who most clearly revealed that damage in me, because she was the person who came closest to making me want to let it go. And instead of letting it go, I had let her go. I said it all steadily, not dramatically, looking at her rather than at the floor or the window or any of the other places a man looks when he is saying something he does not entirely want to be saying. She deserved to be looked at while I said it. That was the least I could offer. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. The house settled around us in the cold afternoon. From the kitchen came the faint sound of something simmering. Outside, a car passed slowly on Deller Road, and the sound of it faded, and the quiet came back. Then she said something I had not expected. She said she knew, not as a correction, not as a way of diminishing what I had said or making it unnecessary. She said it gently, the way you confirm something that has been understood for a long time and is only now being spoken aloud for the first time. She said she had known since December of that year that what I was telling her was not the whole truth. She had been 23 years old, but she had not been naive. And she had known me well enough by then to recognize the difference between a man making a considered decision and a man retreating from something that frightened him. She had not said so at the time because she had her own pride, and she was not going to ask a man to stay who had decided to go, regardless of his reasons. But she had known. I asked her if she had been angry. She thought about that for a moment with genuine consideration. The way she thought about everything, not performing the consideration, but actually doing it. Then she said, yes, for a while. Not the hot, immediate anger of betrayal, but the slower kind. The kind that comes when you have time to understand what actually happened and what it cost you. She had been angry for about 2 years, she said, and then she had decided that anger was too heavy to carry indefinitely, and she had set it down. She had not set me down. That was the distinction she made, quietly and without making too much of it. She had set down the anger, but she had kept the rest of it: the summer, the reservoir, the long drives, the feeling of being known by someone the way you keep the good parts of a thing, even after the thing itself is over. I told her I had kept it too. She looked at me, and I thought for a moment that her eyes were brighter than they had been. Just slightly. The way eyes get when something moves through them that a person is choosing not to let become tears. Then she asked me something that I had not anticipated, and that stopped me entirely. She asked me what I would have done differently, not as a challenge, not as a way of opening old wounds for the pleasure of it. She asked it the way a person asks a question they have genuinely wondered about for a long time and have finally found themselves in a position to ask. I sat with it. I thought about 25-year-old Ray Caldwell in the winter of 1982, in his rented room at Mrs. Alcott's on the east side of Clover Hill, with his second-hand tools and his framing job and his careful, defended heart. I thought about what it would have taken for that man to do something different. I told her the truth. I said I did not know if I could have done differently, given who I was then. I said that the fear was real and the damage behind it was real, and I did not think I had the tools at 25 to dismantle either of them. But I told her that knowing that did not make it all right, because not being capable of something better did not absolve you of the consequences of being less than what the situation required. It just meant that the failure had a source. Understanding the source of a thing was not the same as forgiving yourself for it. She nodded at that. A slow, thoughtful nod that told me she had arrived at similar conclusions about similar things in her own life, and recognized the territory. Then she said something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, however many years that turns out to be. She said that she had not come back to Clover Hill to get any of this from me. She had come because her brother was in a hospital bed, and she loved him, and he needed her here. She had not planned to knock on my door, or seek me out, or revisit any of what had happened between us 42 years ago. She had intended to be quiet about it, the way she had always been quiet about it. But then I had knocked on her door instead, and she was glad I had, not because it changed anything about the past. The past was the past, and both of them had built lives in it, and those lives were real and not to be undone or regretted wholesale. But because there is a difference between a wound that has been acknowledged and a wound that has simply been lived around. She had lived around this one for a very long time. And having it acknowledged, having me sit across from her and say clearly what it had been and what it had cost, was something that she had not known she still needed until it was happening. I understood that I thought about all the things in my own life that I had lived around rather than through. The unsaid things with my father before he passed. The distance with my son that I had told myself was his doing and not mine. The way I had spent 3 years living in Dorothy's absence without ever fully sitting down inside the grief of it, just moving around the edges of it, keeping busy, tending the house, maintaining the routines. I had spent a great deal of my life living around things. We talked for another hour after that. And what we talked about was easier than what had come before. Her life in Virginia, the library work, the garden she kept, the particular quality of autumn in the Shenandoah Valley, which she said was not so different from autumn here, just with different mountains. I told her about the work I had done over the years, the houses I was most proud of, the way my hands still wanted to make things, even now that there was no one who needed them made. She laughed once at something I said, a real laugh, unguarded. The same laugh I remembered from the summer of 1982, and the sound of it in that cold, rented room was one of the better things I had heard in a long time. When I stood up to leave, the light outside had gone the deep blue-gray of a November evening, and the street light at the corner of Deller and Millbrook had come on and was casting a pale circle on the empty road. She walked me to the door. We stood on the threshold for a moment, not awkward, not charged with anything unresolved. Just two people in their 60s standing in a doorway at the end of a significant afternoon, taking a moment before the next part of things began. I told her I would go back to see Earl tomorrow. She said she was going in the morning and asked if I wanted to come with her. I said yes. She nodded. She said 8 o'clock. I said I would be here. I walked back down Deller Road in the dark, with my hands in the pockets of my good wool coat, and the cold air moving quietly around me. And the houses along the road had their lights on now, warm rectangles in the dark. And somewhere a television murmured behind a curtained window. And a dog barked once, and then was quiet. I walked slowly. There was no reason to hurry. Saturday morning, I was at the Faber house at 5 minutes before 8. I had not slept badly, which continued to surprise me. I had expected the accumulated weight of the past few days, the chairs, the hospital, the conversation with Maggie, the apology and everything that had surrounded it, to press down on me through the night and leave me hollow by morning. Instead, I had slept with the particular soundness of a man who has put down something heavy, and whose body has registered the relief before his mind has fully caught up with it. I made my coffee, stood on the porch for a few minutes in the cold dark, and then went and got cleaned up and put on my good coat again and walked down the road. Maggie was ready when I knocked. She came out in a long dark coat with her hair pulled back again and a thermos in her hand, and she offered me coffee from it as we walked to her car, which I accepted. We drove east on the state road in the early morning dark without talking much, which was comfortable rather than strained. The silence of two people who have said the things that needed saying and are not compelled to fill the spaces between them with noise. The fields on either side of the road were white with frost. The sky was just beginning to lighten at the horizon, a faint line of gray above the dark tree line. A hawk sat motionless on a fence post and watched us pass. She drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, her attention on the road. I looked out the passenger window at the passing country and thought about the last time I had ridden in someone else's vehicle to somewhere that mattered, and could not immediately remember when that had been. Dorothy had done most of the driving in our later years because my night vision had gotten unreliable. But that was not quite the same thing. This felt different. This felt like being accompanied rather than transported, which was a distinction I had not thought about in a long time. We arrived at the medical center a few minutes before 8:30. Earl was awake when we came in. He was sitting up a little straighter than he had been on Thursday, and the heaviness on the left side of his face seemed slightly improved. Or maybe I was seeing what I wanted to see. Either way, he looked more like himself, which I realized I now had a sense of, despite having had only one real conversation with the man in my life. Maggie went to him directly and took his hand. Not as a gesture, but as a fact. The way people who love each other well touch each other without announcement, without self-consciousness, simply as the most natural thing in a given moment. He looked at her with an expression I had not seen on his face before, which was the expression of a man who is thoroughly and quietly relieved. I stood back and let them have a minute. Then he looked over at me and nodded. And I pulled the chair up again and sat down. And the three of us were together in that small hospital room in the early morning, in a configuration that none of us had planned, and all of us, I think, recognized as something that had needed to happen for a very long time. We stayed for about 2 hours. Most of what was said in those 2 hours I will keep to myself. Not because it was secret, but because it belonged to the three of us. And some things lose something when you translate them into account for other people. What I will say is that Earl talked more that morning than I had heard him talk in all the time I had known him, which was still not a great amount by most people's standards, but was, for Earl, a kind of openness that I understood was not given lightly or often. He talked about the 20 years on Deller Road, not as confession or explanation, but as simple fact, the way a man reports on a chapter of his life that he is now on the other side of. He said that for most of those 20 years, it had been easy enough. He had his routines, his garden, his woodworking, his Tuesday mornings at Patty's Diner. He had watched the seasons change over the brothers from his front porch, and he had watched my house from the same vantage, and he had not found either of those things burdensome. In the last few years, it had become harder. He did not say why immediately, and I waited. And eventually he said that as he had gotten older, the patience required to keep a thing had become more effortful. Not the keeping of Maggie's secret that had never felt like effort, but the keeping of himself at a distance from a man he had come to know, in his sideways fashion, over 2 decades. He said that in the last year or so, he had thought several times about simply walking through that gate and knocking on my door and saying something. He had not done it because Maggie had not asked him to, and it was not his place. But he had thought about it. I told him I wished he had. He looked at me for a moment and said he was not sure it would have made a difference. Coming from him. He said some things had to arrive from their original source, or they did not land properly. I thought about that and decided he was probably right. Maggie was quiet through most of this, listening the way she listened fully, without interruption, with her complete attention. Once or twice she looked at me while Earl was talking, not to communicate anything specific, but in the way that people look at each other when they are both present in a moment they know matters. Near the end of the visit, Earl asked me something directly. He asked me what I intended to do. I was not entirely sure what he meant, and I told him so. He said it plainly. He said Maggie was in Clover Hill for at least another week, maybe 2, depending on how his recovery went, and what the doctors said about his return home. He said she was 3 houses down the road from me, in a house she was making habitable for as long as she needed to be there. And he said that as far as he could see, the two of us had managed in the last 3 days to say more true things to each other than most people said in a lifetime. And he wanted to know what I thought came next. I looked at Maggie. She looked back at me with those steady brown eyes and did not answer for him, which was the right thing to do. I told Earl honestly that I did not know. I said I was 67 years old, and I had been alone for 3 years, and I had not expected any of this, and I was not going to pretend I knew what shape it should take going forward. I said what I did know was that I was not going to let the time that was left go by the way the time before had gone, quietly and carefully, and with too much distance between myself and the things that mattered. Earl looked at me for a long moment. Then he said that was good enough for him. He said it with a finality that closed the subject without dismissing it. And we moved on to other things. His recovery timeline, the modifications he would need to make to the house when he came home, the physical therapy the doctors had recommended, practical things, the kind of things that anchor a conversation back in the present and remind you that life continues to make its ordinary demands, regardless of what else is happening inside it. I drove Maggie back to Clover Hill just after 10:30, at her suggestion, because she had not slept well and wanted to rest before going back in the afternoon. She sat in the passenger seat of my truck with the empty thermos in her lap and her eyes closed for part of the drive, not sleeping but resting. And I drove carefully on the state road through the late morning country, and did not say anything because there was nothing that needed saying. I dropped her at the Faber house and waited until she was inside before I pulled away, which was an instinct I did not examine. I drove back to my house and parked, and went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment. It was just past 11. The house was warm. I had left the heat on, which I sometimes forgot to do when I went out in the morning, and it smelled of coffee and wood and the particular smell of a house that has been lived in long and steadily by someone who tends it. I went to the front window and looked out at the road. From where I stood, I could see, at the far end of Deller Road, the corner of the Faber house and the bare upper branches of the magnolia tree above the roof line. And to my right, separated from my own front yard by the cedar fence, Earl's house stood empty and quiet in the late morning light. And his front porch was visible from where I stood. And on it, the 2 chairs sat side by side the way they always had. One worn, one waiting. I thought about what Earl had asked me, what I intended to do. I thought about the answer I had given him, which was honest as far as it went, but was not the whole of what I was thinking. The whole of what I was thinking was harder to say, and I had not been ready to say it in that hospital room, with the morning light coming through the window and both of them looking at me. What I was thinking was this. I had spent my life being a man who stayed on his side of the fence, who kept his distance, who managed things from a careful remove and told himself this was wisdom, when most of the time it was simply fear wearing a quieter name. I had lost things because of this. I had kept myself whole in a particular way, intact, defended, undamaged in the obvious ways, and the cost of that wholeness had been a kind of smallness. A life lived a little more narrowly than it needed to be. I was 67 years old, and for the first time in a very long time, the fence did not seem like a boundary I needed to maintain. Earl came home on a Wednesday, 12 days after the ambulance had taken him away in the night, his truck still sitting in the same spot on the gravel drive where it had been sitting when I first noticed something was wrong. He came home in Maggie's silver sedan, with a bag of medications and a set of instructions from the physical therapist, and the particular expression of a man who has spent nearly 2 weeks in a hospital bed and is quietly furious about it, in the way that self-sufficient people get quietly furious about dependency. I was on my porch when they pulled in. I did not make a production of it. I raised a hand from where I was sitting, and Earl, getting out of the car with a careful deliberateness that told me he was working harder than he was letting on, looked over and raised a hand back. It was the same gesture we had exchanged across that fence for 20 years. The acknowledgement between neighbors. The nod that says, "I see you," and nothing more, except that this time it meant something different. This time, it came from the other side of knowing each other. And the weight of it was different. And we both understood that without saying so. Maggie helped him up the porch steps and inside. I stayed where I was and finished my coffee, and looked at the two chairs through the fence, and thought about the days since Saturday and what they had been. The week had passed in a way I had not expected. I had thought, without quite articulating it, that once the significant things had been said, once the apology had been offered and received, and the truth had been aired out into the cold November light, there would be a kind of settling, a return to quiet, the business of ordinary days resuming its proper dominance. Instead, what happened was simpler and stranger than that. Maggie and I had fallen into the habit of each other, not dramatically, not with any declared intention, just the way that two people who live 3 houses apart and have nothing keeping them separate tend to drift toward proximity when proximity is available. She had come by one morning with a question about the heating system. Something was making a noise she did not recognize, and I had gone down and looked at it and found that the filter had not been changed in what appeared to be several years. I had gone to the hardware store and bought a new one and put it in while she made coffee. And we had sat at the Faber House kitchen table afterward and talked for an hour about nothing in particular. And when I left, I had felt, walking back up Deller Road, the particular ease of a man who has spent time in good company. The next day she had called to say she was driving into Harlan to see Earl, and to ask if I wanted to come. I had gone. The day after that I had been working in my garage, reorganizing the workshop, something I did when I needed to think. And she had walked over in the late afternoon and stood in the doorway, watching me sort through the timber I kept stacked against the back wall. And she had said that she had always liked the smell of a woodshop. And I had said, most people did. And she had come in and sat on the old stool by the bench and talked to me while I worked, the way Dorothy used to do. Though I did not draw the comparison aloud, because it was not the same thing, and I was not going to make it into the same thing. It was its own thing. That was what I had come to understand over the course of that week. What was growing back between Maggie and me was not the thing that had existed in the summer of 1982. Recovered and restored like a piece of furniture, stripped back to its original wood. It was something new, built on the same foundation, but shaped by everything that had happened in the decades between her life, my life, Dorothy, the marriage she had left in the late 90s, the years of solitude we had both accumulated, the particular way that people change and do not change over 42 years. It was quieter than what we had been at 25, less urgent, less frightened of itself, and considerably more honest. We had not spoken about what it was or where it was going, because neither of us was in a hurry and neither of us had the particular anxiety about undefined things that younger people have. At 67 and 65 you have learned, if you have learned anything, that the attempt to name a thing too early often does more damage than the uncertainty it is trying to resolve. You let things be what they are. You show up. You drink the coffee. You sit on the stool in the workshop and talk while the man you are with sorts through his timber. And you let that be enough for now. It was more than enough. Earl settling back into his house changed the shape of things slightly, which was natural. Maggie's attention shifted toward him, the medications, the exercises the physical therapist had demonstrated, the meals she brought over, and the mornings she spent at his kitchen table making sure he was doing what the doctors had told him to do. which he was not always inclined to do without supervision. Earl was not a difficult patient exactly, but he was a man who had spent his entire adult life being self-sufficient, and being looked after sat on him with a mild but perceptible weight that he bore with more grace than I might have managed in his position. I went over the day after he came home. I knocked on his door in the mid-morning, the way neighbors do when they are checking in rather than visiting. And Earl called me in, and I found him at his kitchen table, with a cup of coffee and the county paper, and a look of general contentment that suggested his own kitchen was considerably more comfortable than a hospital room. I sat down across from him, and we had the kind of conversation that we had been building toward in pieces over the previous 12 days. Not the significant things, which had mostly been said, but the ordinary things. The mundane exchange of two men who live next door to each other and have finally gotten around to actually talking. He told me about the improvements he had been meaning to make to the workshop and had been putting off for 2 years. I told him about the gutter project I had finished while he was in the hospital, which he said he had noticed and which I found obscurely satisfying. We talked about the winter coming in and whether the long-range forecast meant anything, which it usually does not. It was ordinary. It was exactly what it needed to be. Before I left, I stood in the doorway for a moment and told him I was glad he was home. He looked at me over his coffee cup with those level gray eyes and said he was glad to be home. Then he said something else, quietly, in the same tone he used for all the things that mattered. He said he was glad I had finally come through the gate. The second week of December came in cold and clear. The brothers were dusted with snow along their upper ridges, not enough to amount to anything down in the valley, just enough to show white against the pale sky on clear mornings. The way the mountains reminded you each year that they were still paying attention, even when the weather in town was only gray and cold. I had always liked that about this part of Tennessee. The mountains did not let you forget the season. Maggie had been in Clover Hill for 3 weeks by then. She had said, that first day, that she would stay until Earl was well enough to manage on his own. Earl was managing on his own. He was doing his exercises with the diligence of a man who had been told exactly what would happen if he did not. And he was taking his medications. And he was driving himself into town on Tuesdays again, though not yet Thursdays, a concession to the doctor's recommendation that he ease back gradually, which had required some negotiation. He was not fully himself yet, but he was close enough that the question of Maggie staying had shifted from necessity to choice. She was choosing to stay a little longer. She had not said it directly. She had said she wanted to make sure Earl was settled, and that she was not in a hurry to get back, that there was nothing pressing in Virginia that could not wait, that the library consortium work she did part-time was the kind of thing that could be done from anywhere with an internet connection, and she had her laptop. She said all of this practically, matter-of-factly, without looking at me with any particular significance while she said it. But she was choosing to stay. I understood that, and did not make her say it more plainly than she wanted to. We had developed a rhythm by then, the three of us, that felt natural in the way that things feel natural when they have found their proper shape without being forced into it. Mornings were mostly my own. I had my coffee on the porch, did whatever the day required of the house or the yard, spent time in the workshop if I had something to work on. I had started a small project, a side table. Nothing elaborate, just something to keep my hands moving and my mind occupied in the productive way that making things had always occupied it. There is a particular kind of thinking that happens when you are working with wood. A kind of thinking that does not feel like thinking at all, where the mind goes quiet and what needs to be understood arranges itself without being forced. I was doing a great deal of that kind of thinking. In the afternoons, Maggie and I tended to find each other. Sometimes she came by. Sometimes I walked down to the Faber house. Sometimes we drove somewhere into town, or out along the county roads that wound through the valley between the brothers. through the bare brown countryside that had a particular austere beauty this time of year that I had always appreciated, and that Maggie, it turned out, appreciated in the same way. We had that in common, among other things: a preference for the unornamented, a comfort with quiet, a tendency to say less than we were thinking and mean more than we said. Earl joined us occasionally, not always, and not for long when he did, because he was still tiring more easily than he was accustomed to, and his body was making demands on his energy that his disposition resented. But sometimes, on a clear afternoon, the three of us would sit on Earl's front porch, Earl in his chair, Maggie in the second chair, the one she had made 18 years ago in a night in Earl's workshop. And I pulled up a third chair from inside, and we would sit together in the cold and watch Delaware Road, and talk about small things, and sometimes not talk at all. Those afternoons were among the best things I had experienced in a long time. There was something in them that I found difficult to name precisely, and did not try too hard to name, because I had learned my lesson about forcing names onto things. What I can say is that sitting on that porch with those two people, in the thin winter light of a Tennessee December, felt like a kind of wholeness. Not the wholeness of completion. I was not naive enough to think that everything had been resolved or that the losses of the past had been undone. Dorothy was still gone. The years were still spent. The choices of 1982 were still made, and their consequences were still real. But wholeness does not require perfection. I had spent most of my life not quite understanding that. I had believed, at some level beneath conscious thought, that to be whole you had to be without damage. That the cracks in a man disqualified him from the kind of life that the uncracked people had. That the things you had done wrong, and the fear you had carried, and the distance you had maintained, were permanent marks that set a ceiling on what was available to you. Sitting on that porch, I understood that this was not true. The cracks were there. They would always be there. But they did not define the ceiling. They were just part of the material part of what you were made of, the way wood has grain and knot and variation. And none of that makes it unsuitable for making something good. It just means you work with what it is, rather than pretending it is something else. One evening in the middle of that second week of December, Maggie and I were sitting in my kitchen after dinner. She had brought soup she had been cooking more at the Faber house. She said, because cooking for one was something she did out of necessity at home, and cooking for others was something she did for pleasure. And it pleased her to have others nearby to cook for. The soup was good. The kitchen was warm. The dark came early the way it did in December, and the windows were black, and the lamp over the table made a warm circle that held us both inside it. We had been talking about her house in Virginia, the garden she was looking forward to getting back to in the spring, the particular quality of the light there in early April, the way the valley greened up almost overnight after the last frost. She talked about it with a fond specificity that told me she loved the place, that it was genuinely home to her, that going back to it was not a retreat, but a return. I listened and thought about what that meant for the question neither of us had yet asked directly. Eventually, I asked it. I told her I had been thinking about what came next. Not for Earl, not for the immediate situation that was resolving itself naturally, but for the two of us. What came next for that? She was quiet for a moment. She wrapped both hands around her soup bowl, the way she wrapped her hands around a coffee mug, which I had come to understand was something she did when she was thinking carefully about something. She said she had been thinking about it too. She said she did not know what it looked like practically. She had her house and her life in Virginia, and those were real, and she was not going to pretend otherwise or dissolve them into something new, because the feeling of a few weeks in December suggested it might be simpler. She had built that life carefully, and it mattered to her. I said I understood that. I said I was not asking her to dissolve anything. She looked at me steadily and asked what I was asking. I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, I was asking whether we were both willing to find out. Not to commit to an outcome. I was 67 years old, and she was 65, and we were long past the age of making grand declarations and expecting the future to cooperate. But to find out. To not let the distance between Virginia and Tennessee and the uncertainty about what this was and what it might become be the reason we backed away from it. I had backed away from things because of uncertainty before. I was not interested in doing it again. She was quiet for a long time after I said that. Long enough that I had time to sit with the possibility that the answer might be no, or not yet, or some version of careful hesitation that amounted to the same thing. I sat with that possibility, honestly and without panic, which was itself something new for me. The ability to ask a real question and wait for a real answer, without already having one foot out the door. Then she said yes. Just that. Yes. With the same quiet directness she brought to everything, looking at me across the kitchen table in the warm lamplight. Her hands still wrapped around the bowl. I nodded. I said good. She almost smiled. We finished the soup and washed the bowls, and she put on her coat to walk back down the road. And I walked her to the door and stood on the porch while she went down the steps and up the road, her dark coat moving through the small arc of the porch light and then disappearing into the dark beyond it. I stood there until I could not see her anymore, and then I went back inside. I sat down in Dorothy's chair by the front window and looked out at the dark road. I thought about Dorothy then, the way I often did in that chair. But I thought about her differently than I sometimes had. Not with the weight of comparison or the guilt of a man who believes moving forward is a kind of betrayal. Dorothy had been a woman who believed in living. She had believed in it the way some people believe in a principle practically, daily, without sentimentality. She would not have wanted me to sit in her chair for the rest of my days and treat the living as something that had stopped when she did. She would have had opinions about Maggie. Probably. Knowing Dorothy, she would have had quite a few opinions, and she would not have kept all of them to herself. And some of them would have made me laugh, and some of them would have made me think, and she would have been right about most of them. Because she usually was. I missed her with the familiar steadiness of a man who has learned to carry grief as a companion rather than a weight. It does not get smaller. You just get stronger. Or you get used to the shape of it, which amounts to the same thing in practice. I sat in that chair for a while longer, and then I went to bed. There is a thing that happens when you stop living around the edges of your own life and start living in the middle of it. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with any particular ceremony or feeling of transformation. It is more like the way a room looks different when you finally open the curtains that have been drawn for a long time. Not dramatically different, not unrecognizable, just lighter. The same room, the same furniture, the same walls, but with the light coming in the way it was always meant to come in. I noticed it first in small things. I started calling my son. Not the once-a-month call we had maintained for years, the careful, slightly formal exchange of information that kept the line open without really using it. I called him on a Tuesday evening in the second week of December for no particular reason, no occasion, no news to report. I called him because I wanted to talk to him, which was something I had always felt and rarely acted on. And the gap between the feeling and the action had been one of the distances I had maintained without examining why. His name is Thomas. He is 41 years old, and he lives in Nashville, and he works in commercial real estate, and he has a daughter named Clara who is 7, and who I see maybe 3 times a year, which is not enough, and which I had always told myself was the natural consequence of distance, without ever asking honestly whether the distance was as fixed as I pretended. He answered on the second ring, and there was a brief pause. The pause of a man who is used to once-a-month calls and is recalibrating his expectations. And then he said, "Hey, Dad." And I said, "Hey." And we talked for 45 minutes. Not about anything important. At first. His week, Clara's school play, which had apparently involved a great deal of rehearsal, and a costume that had required 3 separate trips to the craft store. The commercial property market in Nashville, which he said was complicated in ways he spent 10 minutes explaining, and I spent 10 minutes trying to follow. Small things. The texture of a life reported to a father who had not been asking often enough to get the texture of it. Then he asked how I was doing, not the version of the question that expects a fine in response. He asked it with a particular attention that told me he was genuinely asking. And I thought about the fine I had been giving for 3 years, and I decided not to give it this time. I told him it had been an unusual few weeks. I told him about Earl, the stroke, the hospital, the things I had learned about my neighbor that I had not known in 20 years of living next door to him. I did not tell him about Maggie yet. I was not sure how to tell him about Maggie, and I thought it was better to let that conversation find its own time rather than force it into the first honest phone call we had managed in years. But I told him about Earl, and about the chairs, and about the general shape of what the past few weeks had been. And he listened without interrupting, which was something he had always been good at. He got that from Dorothy. And when I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "It sounded like things were changing down there." I told him yes. I said things were changing. He said that was good. Dad. And he said it in a way that made me understand he had been waiting for it, or something like it, for a while. That he had been watching his father be fine from a distance, the same way Earl had watched me from across the fence, with concern kept at a respectful remove, uncertain whether to step through the gate or stay on his own side. I told him I wanted him and Claire to come down after Christmas. I said I had room, and it would be a good time, and I would like to see them. He said he would check with Claire's mother. They had been divorced for 4 years. A fact I had absorbed and filed without sufficiently understanding what it had cost him. And he thought they could make it work. I said, "Good." We talked for a few more minutes, and then said goodnight. And after I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing done that should have been done sooner and would have been harder if left any longer. That was a feeling I was becoming acquainted with in a new way. The satisfaction of not waiting. I thought about my father then, the way I occasionally did when I was thinking about the patterns that pass between generations, whether you invite them to or not. My father had been a man who maintained his distances with a thoroughness that I had internalized so completely I had spent most of my life not even recognizing it as a choice. He had died when I was 52, and we had not said the things that needed saying. And I had carried that unfinished business as a permanent low-level weight that I had stopped noticing the same way you stop noticing a sound that has been present long enough. I could not go back and finish that business, but I could stop repeating the pattern with Thomas. That was the thing about understanding where a habit comes from. You cannot undo its history, but you can stop feeding it forward. You can decide that the thing ends with you, that whatever your father gave you that served him but does not serve you, whatever you absorbed from the particular atmosphere of the house you grew up in, does not have to travel any further down the line. That was something worth leaving behind. The real kind of legacy. Not money or property or the name on a mailbox. The decision to stop passing on the damage. The choice, late, imperfect, but real. To say the true things while there was still time to say them. Still here. Still yours. 4 words carved into wood by a woman who had needed somewhere to put what she was carrying. I had spent 20 years 40 feet from those words without knowing they were there. And now I knew. And the knowing had changed something in me that I did not think was going to change back. I went to the workshop after the phone call and worked on the side table for a while. It was coming along well. The joints were clean, the proportions were right, and the particular piece of cherry wood I had chosen for the top had a grain that ran warm and straight through the center, and opened into a subtle figure near the edges that I had not anticipated when I started, and that was now my favorite thing about it. That was often how it worked with wood. You began with a plan, and the material told you something you had not planned for. And if you were paying attention, you let it tell you, rather than trying to force the wood into being something other than what it was. I thought about that for a while, with my hands moving over the surface in the warm workshop light. The material tells you something, if you pay attention. I had not always paid attention. I was paying attention now. 3 days before Christmas, on a cold, clear Saturday morning, with frost on every surface, and the brothers showing more snow along their ridges than they had yet that season. I walked down Deller Road to the Faber house with the side table under my arm. It was not a grand gesture. I had not made it as a grand gesture. I had made it because I had been making things my whole life, and giving them to people was the most natural way I knew to say something I did not always have the words for. The table was solid and well proportioned, and the cherry top was beautiful in the particular way that honest work is beautiful. And I wanted her to have it. She answered the door in her reading glasses, with her book in her hand, which meant I had interrupted something. And she looked at the table, and then at me, and then at the table again. I told her I had made it, and I wanted her to have it for the house in Virginia. For whatever room needed a table. She took her glasses off and looked at it properly for a moment, the way a person looks at something made by hand when they understand what looking properly means. And she ran her fingers along the cherry top, the way I had run mine 100 times while making it. She said it was beautiful. I said I was glad she thought so. She stepped back and let me bring it inside, and we found a place for it in the front room, near the window, where the winter light came in and lay across the cherry surface and showed the grain the way I had hoped it would. She stood back and looked at it there, and I stood beside her, and we both looked at it in the winter light. Then she turned to me and said something that I will carry with me. She said that in 42 years she had received gifts from people who meant well and gifts from people who loved her, and she had learned to tell the difference, and that this was the second kind. I did not say anything. She did not seem to need me to. We had coffee at the kitchen table and talked about Christmas. She was driving up to Virginia the following week to spend the holiday with friends, and would be back in the new year, which we both understood as a thing that was settled rather than uncertain. She would come back. I would be here. Whatever this was would continue. To find out what it was. Before she left that afternoon, she went to Earl's to check on him, and I walked with her. And the three of us had coffee in Earl's kitchen in the late afternoon, while the light outside went from gold to gray, and the day settled into the particular stillness of a winter Saturday in a small town that has finished its business and is resting. Earl was doing well. Better than well, by his own standards, which meant he was managing everything himself and had only needed Maggie's intervention twice that week, which he reported with the satisfaction of a man reclaiming his independence one small increment at a time. He had been out to the workshop that morning, he said, just to look at things. Not to do anything yet, but to look. I told him that was a start. He said that was generally how things began. We sat in his kitchen, and the afternoon went dark outside, and the lamp on the counter made a warm pool of light that held all three of us. And at some point, the conversation ran out of things to say, and we simply sat in the quiet together. The comfortable quiet of people who have gotten through something and are on the other side of it, and are not yet ready to move away from the table. Christmas came and went quietly. I drove to the Baptist church on Christmas Eve the way I had done most years, more out of habit than conviction. Though I had found over the past few years that habit and conviction were not always as separate as I had once believed. There is something in the repetition of a thing, the same carols, the same candles, the same familiar faces in the same pews, that carries its own kind of meaning independent of doctrine. You show up because showing up is itself the thing. Because being present in a place and a moment, with other people who have also chosen to be present, is a form of acknowledgement that the moment matters. Dorothy had always loved Christmas Eve service. I sat in the third pew from the back, which was where we had always sat. And I thought about her the way I always did in that church. And I let the music move through me, the way music does when you are not trying to hold it at a distance. And by the time I walked back out into the cold night under the stars, I felt the particular lightness that comes from having been somewhere fully rather than partially. Thomas and Clara arrived the day after Christmas. They drove down from Nashville on a Thursday morning and pulled into my driveway just before noon in Thomas's car. And Clara came out of the back seat at a full run, the way 7-year-olds exit vehicles, as though the car were a temporary and inconvenient interruption to whatever she had been planning to do next. She ran up the porch steps and collided with me at the door, with the absolute confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt her welcome. And I held on to her for a moment with my hands around her small shoulders, and felt something move through me that was simple and uncomplicated, and did not require any examination at all. She smelled of the car and of the particular sweetness that children have. And she was talking before I had fully let go of her about the drive, about a song she had heard on the radio, about something her friend at school had said before the break. And I listened to all of it, and took her inside and showed her where the cookies were, which redirected her attention immediately and completely. Thomas came in behind her with the bags. He was taller than I remembered, which was not possible, and was only the effect of not having seen him in several months. He had Dorothy's eyes, that clear, direct gaze that did not look away from things, and the set of his shoulders had a quality I recognized as my own. The slight forward lean of a man who carries things without asking for help. We embraced in the doorway, in the slightly careful way of fathers and sons who love each other and are learning how to show it. And it was imperfect, and it was genuine, and it was the best we had. They stayed for 3 days. Those 3 days were among the fullest I had spent in a long time. Not full of events. Nothing much happened, by ordinary measures. We ate, we walked, we drove out along the county roads, and I showed Thomas the countryside the way I had always wanted to show it to someone who was mine. Clara had opinions about everything she saw, which she expressed freely and at length, and her opinions were frequently wrong and occasionally brilliant and always entertaining. And by the second day, I had decided she was one of the most interesting people I had met in years. Thomas and I talked in the evenings after Clara was in bed. We talked the way we had talked on the phone in December, honestly, without the careful management of information that had characterized our conversations for too many years. He told me things about his life that I had not known, or had known only in outline. The divorce, what it had cost him, the particular loneliness of rebuilding a life in your late 30s, while also trying to be a good father on alternating weekends. He told me he had been worried about me since Dorothy died, and that the worry had been compounded by the fact that he had not known how to say so, without feeling like he was intruding on a grief that was not his to manage. I told him it would not have been intruding. He said he knew that now. I told him about Maggie. I had been thinking about how to tell him since the phone call in December, and had not come up with a satisfactory approach. So I did what I had been practicing lately, which was to simply say the true thing and trust that the relationship was strong enough to hold it. I told him about the summer of 1982, about Maggie, about December of that year and the choice I had made and why. I told him about Earl moving in next door and what I had not known. I told him about the 2 chairs and the 4 words carved into the wood, and the silver sedan with Virginia plates in the Faber house driveway. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, the way he went quiet when he was thinking rather than reacting. Then he said that it explained some things. I asked him what things. He said it explained a quality he had noticed in me his whole life, a kind of careful distance from the things that mattered most, a habit of standing just outside the warmth rather than inside it. He said he had always thought it was just who I was. He said he was glad to know it was something that could change. I told him it was something that was changing. He nodded. He looked at his coffee cup for a moment, and then looked up at me and asked if he could meet her. I said I thought that could be arranged. He smiled, which was Dorothy's smile, that sudden, unguarded thing that arrived without announcement and changed the whole quality of his face. And I sat across from my son in my kitchen at 11 o'clock on a December night and felt, quietly and without making too much of it, grateful, not for any one thing, for the general fact of it. The table with 2 coffee cups, the sleeping child in the guest room, the lamp making its warm circle, the house holding us the way it had been holding things for 39 years. The morning they left, I stood on the porch and watched Thomas back out of the driveway, while Clara waved at me through the rear window, with the total commitment that children bring to waving, arm fully extended, whole body involved, as though the act of being seen across a distance required everything she had. I waved back until the car turned at the end of Deller Road and disappeared. Then I stood on the porch in the cold December morning and looked out at the road and at Earl's house beyond the fence and at the 2 chairs on his porch. And I thought about legacy. Not in the abstract way that the word sometimes gets used, not as a concept or a category, but concretely, specifically, what I would leave behind when I was gone, and whether it would be worth leaving. I had spent most of my life building things with my hands. Houses, furniture, the careful structures of domestic life. I was good at it, and I was proud of the work, and it would outlast me in the way that solid things outlast the people who make them. That was a kind of legacy, but the other kind, the kind that traveled through people rather than through objects, that was the one I had been less careful with. The patterns I had passed toward Thomas without meaning to, the distances I had maintained, the things left unsaid with my father that Thomas had nearly inherited with me, the things that were changing now, that was the legacy that mattered most. Not the houses I had built, or the furniture I had made, or the solid, reliable craftsmanship of a working life. The decision to stop passing on the damage, the choice late, imperfect, but real, to say the true things while there was still time to say them. Still here, still yours. 4 words carved into wood by a woman who had needed somewhere to put what she was carrying. I had spent 20 years, 40 feet from those words, without knowing they were there. And now I knew. And the knowing had changed something in me that I did not think was going to change back. I went inside and made my coffee and took it to the porch and sat down in my chair. And the morning was cold and clear, and the brothers were bright with snow along their upper ridges. And Deller Road was empty and quiet in the early light, the way it was most mornings. And Earl's house was still and patient on the other side of the fence. In the new year, Maggie would come back. Thomas and Clara would come again in the spring, when the countryside was green, and Clara could see the valley the way it looked when it was fully itself. Earl would get back to his workshop, and I would get back to mine. And on some afternoons, we would find ourselves working on opposite sides of the fence at the same time. The sound of tools in the cold air, Two men who had arrived late at the understanding that neighbors were worth knowing. And on some evenings, when the day had been good and the light was right, there would be coffee at a kitchen table, or a walk along the county roads in the last of the afternoon, or three people sitting on a porch in the particular quiet of a Tennessee winter, watching the road and saying whatever needed to be said, and leaving the rest in the comfortable silence where it belonged. I sat on my porch and drank my coffee and looked out at the morning. I had lived on this road for 39 years. I intended to live on it a while longer, and for the first time and longer than I could precisely remember, that intention felt like something more than endurance. It felt like a beginning. Thank you for spending this time with Ray's story. If it moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love or something you have been meaning to say, I hope you will carry that feeling with you. Please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who might need to hear it today. God bless you, and we will see you next time.